Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so when we think of the 1960s, we usually picture this wildly kinetic decade, right? Massive social shifts and a literal cultural revolution happening right out there on the dance floor. The way young people were suddenly moving their bodies, it was basically a declaration of independence from those super structured, partner-dependent ballroom traditions that their parents grew up with. But today, we're going to dive into the really fascinating history behind the dance that actually kickstarted that whole movement. And as you'll see, it's a story that stretches way, way beyond 1960s pop culture, tracing all the way back to West Africa. So, who actually invented the twist? I mean, if you ask most people, they'll immediately point to a very specific 1960s pop star. But today, we're going to put on our cultural detective hats and really dig into the truth here. Because the story of this dance goes back a lot further than some television studio in Philadelphia. And honestly, unraveling its true origins reveals this incredibly rich, complex narrative about American history, music, and culture. All right, let's set the stage. In 1960, a 19-year-old singer named StockChecker drops a mainstream version of a song called The Twist. And it does something absolutely incredible. It makes history. This track uniquely hit the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100, not just once, but twice. It completely dominated the charts in September of 1960, and then, miraculously, surged right back to #1 again in early 1962. We're talking about a global dance craze that completely transcended age and class. You had teenagers doing it at school dances, and you had their parents doing it at high-end supper clubs. But the story of how Checker actually got that #1 hit, well, it involves a pretty massive bait and switch. See, the twist was ultimately packaged and heavily marketed for mainstream, middle-class, white America. You can get a perfect feel for that right here with the Candyman Orchestra's album cover. Just look at the vibe. The dancers are all smiles, sharply dressed in evening wear, and the whole thing is presented as this squeaky clean, totally wholesome craze. And that was exactly what the television tastemakers of the era were demanding. They absolutely wanted the infectious energy of the music, for sure, but they needed the whole package to look completely safe and palatable for living rooms across the country. Which brings us to that bait and switch I mentioned. A whole year before StockChecker's massive hit, back in 1959, an R&B artist named Hank Ballard and his group, the Midnighters, actually recorded the original version of The Twist. And Ballard's record was definitely catching on. But Dick Clark, who was the hugely influential host of American Bandstand, he felt Ballard's authentic R&B version, along with Ballard's history of some pretty risque lyrics, was just way too suggestive for his mainstream television audience. So Clark urges the Cameo Parkway record label to create a cover. They bring in this young, super cheerful singer named Ernest Evans, who had this real knack for impersonating other artists. They slapped the stage name StockChecker on him, which was actually a play on the name of music legend Fats Domino, and Checker records a nearly identical, literally note-for-note cover of Ballard's song, and it was that wholesome version that got blasted across national television. But wait, here's where our cultural detective work gets really, really fascinating. Hank Ballard? He didn't actually invent the dance either. Actually, the true origins of both the song and the dance trace straight back to gospel music. A gospel singer named Joseph "Jojo" Wallace, he was a member of the Philadelphia-based Sensational Nightingales, originally came up with the concept. He remembered this specific dance his sister used to do when they were kids down in North Carolina. So Wallace and his group developed the song, but they ultimately decide, it's just not quite right for a gospel act. So in the late 1950s, while they were all staying at the exact same hotel in Tampa, Florida, they passed the song along to Hank Ballard. And that hotel handoff is a big deal, because the physical movements of the twist have an even deeper history. The fundamental mechanics of the dance, planting your feet, swiveling your hips, and moving your arms and legs independently, those are directly based on traditional West African dance movements. So we're looking at a pretty incredible timeline here. From pre-1900s West Africa, these specific movements survived and evolved through dances popular among enslaved people in the American South. From there, they flow right into the Black gospel community of the 1950s, inspiring Jojo Wallace, which then leads to Hank Ballard's R&B recording in '59, and finally landing in mainstream American living rooms via StockChecker in 1960. It's a direct, chronological journey of cultural survival and expression. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to look at a concept defined by the scholar Katrina Hazard-Gordon. She calls it the Juk Continuum. Basically, this refers to African American vernacular dance traditions that are aesthetically and socially grounded in communal Black culture. So, the really crucial takeaway here is that the twist wasn't just some random fad fabricated by a producer in a recording studio. No way. It owed a massive historical debt to Black churchgoers, to grassroots communities, and to a very long lineage of African American social dance that celebrated individual bodily expression. And keep in mind, the twist was absolutely not an isolated event. The 1960s saw this massive floodgate of new dance styles emerge, and nearly all of them shared these exact same Black cultural roots. Just think of the mashed potato, right, with its deeply soulful, grounded energy. Or the jerk, with those staccato movements reflecting the harder-edged R&B coming out of Detroit. Then you had the Watusi, the hitchhike. These weren't just abstract inventions. They were specific Black cultural traditions that crossed over into mainstream white popular culture. They were popularized through radio and on newly integrating dance floors, bringing an entirely new level of solo, free-form expression to America's youth. But, as you might guess, not everyone was quite ready for that level of free-form expression. Back in 1961, the Hollywood ballroom dancing legend Ginger Rogers famously called the twist ungraceful, vulgar, and exhibitionism personified. She even went so far as to call it the most obscene dance she had ever seen. Now, this scathing critique really highlights the era's underlying racial friction. Traditional ballroom dancing was incredibly structured, right? One person leads, one follows, the couple moves as a single polite unit. The twist completely shattered that structure. Dancers stood apart, swiveling their hips totally independently. For the establishment, this kind of solo bodily autonomy, which was rooted so deeply in Black vernacular dance, well, it was viewed with a lot of suspicion and fear. And that reaction brings us to a historical pattern that just keeps repeating itself. The journey of the twist essentially established a playbook of cultural appropriation. We can think of it as a cycle of commodification. Here's how it goes. Step 1, a dance is created organically within grassroots Black communities. Step 2, it gets labeled by the mainstream establishment as vulgar or too risque. Step 3, it's whitewashed, right? Packaged in a more palatable format for mainstream television. And usually, the original creators get entirely sidelined. And then finally, step 4, it gets heavily monetized by corporate entities, record labels, and white businessmen who end up reaping the vast majority of the financial rewards. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's wild for the 60s, but this cycle isn't just some relic of the past. It's exactly why understanding this history matters right now, today. If we compare the 1960s to the 2020s, we are seeing the exact same cycle play out. Back then, it was regional dances being scouted and broadcast nationally on American Bandstand. Today, it's viral dances created by Black youth on social media that get lifted, popularized by mainstream influencers, and then sold as incredibly lucrative emotes in blockbuster video games like Fortnite. The tech has definitely evolved from black and white TV to global digital platforms, but the actual process of commodifying communal Black culture, it remains incredibly similar. Which leaves us with a final, pretty profound question to mull over. From the West African origins of the twist, traveling through the gospel choirs of the 1950s, all the way to the viral TikTok challenges we see today, who truly owns a dance? When these grassroots cultural expressions are transformed into massive commercial crazes, where does the credit and the compensation really belong? It's a deeply complex issue woven into the very fabric of American pop culture, and it's one that continues to play out every single time a new dance sweeps the globe. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope the next time you see a viral dance trend pop up on your feed, you take a second to remember the deep, fascinating history of the twist.